Waking Up in the Mage Army, Volume 1. Please like and subscribe. In the nation of the Bay Area Empire, magic is a daily part of everyday life. The Bay Area Empire is the largest nation in the known world, covering over half the continent. With its towering cities in the capital, Bay Area's nobility enjoyed exquisite luxuries, such as running water in every home. Created from magic stones that would emit a warm blue glow as they created fresh, clean water. Each residence possessing lanterns endowed with magic to shine brightly without the need for candles, wicks, or oil. Instead, they contain magical steel oars that lit up in the absence of sunlight. Every aspect of daily living for the nobility was handled magnificently with magical aid. Unfortunately for those born outside of the nobility, life wasn't so grand. Commoners of the Bay Area Empire often couldn't afford to eat every day, and to acquire the luxuries of magical items was something closer to a dream than to reality. Riker, a boy only 14 years of age, was one such commoner. He spent nearly every day wondering where he would find his next meal. Without a home or family, he grew up alone without many friends to speak of. As far back as Riker could remember, he had lived in a small corner of an alley where he kept his things. It was a dark, cold, and gloomy place, but at least it was dry. He fashioned a tarp to cover his alley corner made from discarded clothes found in other back streets. They were dirty, smelled, but at least they did the job. Finding work was always a challenge for him because despite how depressing his existence was, it was not uncommon. In the Bay Area Empire's higher society, it was acceptable for nobles to have several wives, concubines, and they would also occasionally patron the local brothels. This was because, in the Bay Area Empire, men who were strong could do whatever they pleased. Might makes right was the empire's national policy, so, naturally, stronger men of noble blood did as they pleased. Riker, born in a brothel, was likely the result of a nobleman blowing off some steam from his daily routine. Children like him were often abandoned because women without the money to feed a newborn infant would find herself starving before long. Orphanages seemed always to be full to capacity, so newborn infants were often left out with the trash and rain. Despite this rough start, Riker miraculously had survived 14 years in these conditions thanks to the care of a nun named Sister Neela. Although she could no longer care for him after the age of 10, he still thanked her with his life. He was a small boy for his age, only 4 feet 11 inches in height, with a small wire-like frame. He had black soot-covered hair with brown and white tints, that smelled of smoke and sulfur from working in the local factories. His skin was rough and pale from lack of nutrition. By anyone's definition, he looked pathetic. The only thing that made Riker stand out were his eyes. Despite being half open, they were sharp. His right eye was crimson red, with tints of yellow softly glowing within them. His left eye was emerald green with the same golden flicker that seemed to dance behind the emerald color, much like his right eye. Although physical traits that appeared magical in nature were not uncommon in this magical world, it still distinguished Riker a little. When he was lucky enough to find work, his employers would often refer to him by the characteristics of his eyes rather than bother to learn his name. They would call him Golden Eyes or Red Eye to pick him out of the crowd of other starving children looking for work. For this reason, Riker was thankful for his eyes, because he would have surely starved to death long ago without them to distinguish him from the crowd. To preserve his mental sanity, Riker often used humor to avoid his depression. Making a joke in dark or depressing situations always made him feel at ease and allowed him to continue onward, to see the next day. Unfortunately, with his eyes never seeming to open completely, combined with his natural grin that had a dark quality to it, others often interpreted his smile as aggressive, condescending, or sarcastic. This led to many unfortunate misunderstandings with others. Without large muscles, in addition to being born in the Bay Area Empire, Riker was often beaten within an inch of his life by others who misinterpreted his smile. One day, while working in the local coal mine processing magical ore, Riker stumbled upon a large chunk of magical ore that seemed out of the ordinary. Upon further investigation, the ore glowed differently than other magical ore he had seen before. Normally magic ore glowed in accordance with the element it was endowed with. Red ore was endowed with fire, blue with water, brown with earth, white with wind, and so on. There were many more types of magical ore, some more rare than others, each with their own values depending on their quality and endowments. Upon picking it up, the glowing ore crumbled to ash like used charcoal that had turned white in a hot fire. It crumbled to dust as it glowed a soft purple when it made contact with his skin. In his shock, he gasped, breathing in some of the ash. He then sneezed, falling back on his ass. He looked around, but luckily no one took any note of him. Lucky or not, being a common peasant came with the benefit of never being embarrassed because no one cared about you in the first place, or so he thought. After work, he got in line to receive his pay with the other day laborers. They were all filthy, tired, smelled of the mines, and drenched in sweat. Despite everything, Riker was thankful to work that day because he was down to his last 4 copper coins. As he waited in line to receive his payment, knowing he would only receive 10 copper coins, he let his mind wander about, thinking of the day-old bread and ale he would drink that night. As the line moved further along, his plans became grander and grander, eventually tinging on the border of delusion. When it was his turn in line, the manager who had hired him looked away with a frown. "I didn't realize there were so many of you brats today. That's all the money I'm going to pay, any more and it will eat into my profits. Try again tomorrow," the man said. This was not uncommon in Riker's world, but nonetheless, he was down to his last few copper coins and had spent the last few moments fantasizing about the bread and ale he was going to drink. The manager's words were like a bucket of cold water being thrown on him in a winter storm. Riker was pissed. He wanted to snap and punch the man right in that greedy-looking face that had just cheated him. However, he knew doing that would mean he wouldn't be able to find work in the future. For better or for worse, his eyes made him stand out, so punching this manager would surely cause him more trouble in the future than it was worth. Riker instead smiled wryly and said, "Paying over half of us in one day? That must be a new record for you. You dirty brat, I'll teach you," the man said as he backhanded Riker. Due to his wire-like frame, thin and frail from malnutrition, Riker's body was sent flying. The man who had hit him had used magic to enhance the swing of his arm to superhuman levels. Riker had plenty of time to think as his body flew across the building. He thought about how he should use his last few copper coins, what he would have for dinner that night, how he cursed his existence, and of course, how he would piss in that bastard manager's flask the next time he got the chance. He grinned widely with these thoughts as his body flew through the air, and slammed into the wall creating a large cloud of dust, knocking him unconscious. When he woke up, some time later, he decided to spend the last of his copper coins at the local tavern. 4 copper coins were enough for 2 mugs of ale. He figured he had enough for 1 mug and could try gambling to perhaps win a few coppers more for 3 or 4 additional mugs of ale. At this point, he didn't think his day could get much worse, so even if he lost while gambling, so long as he had his 1 guaranteed mug of ale, that would get him through the night. The walk to the local tavern took him through several back alley streets. These back streets were a dreary, dark, dirty place filled with people who would harvest your organs to make a quick copper coin or 2 without feeling any remorse. Luckily, the people who lived in these alley back streets hiding their faces were just as frail and malnourished as Riker. So as long as he didn't get drunk and pass out in this place, they would leave him be. Honestly, they were more like vultures than people. After what seemed like the longest walk of his life, Riker finally made it to the tavern. The tavern itself was small but very loud. Despite having only 5 tables, there was always a loud commotion going on in this place. That was because not only the local day laborers came here due to how cheap the prices were, but this place was also commonly filled with soldiers from the Royal Army. Soldiers would come here to discuss topics that were considered socially unacceptable in the capital cities without the fear of being scrutinized by the nobility. The name of this tavern was Titania's Tavern, named after the owner. If one needed to transport illegal goods, find a strong bodyguard, or even hire an assassin, Titania's Tavern was the place to go. Despite being well known by the nobility, they would never consider shutting down the tavern because of its usefulness. Riker walked to the counter, and ordered a mug. He found a stool at the bar, swung himself around, and looked around to see what kind of gambling was going on tonight. In one corner of the room, he saw a game of dice being played. The dice game they played was a simple one. The players would first make their bets, placing them on the table, The players would then take turns rolling a pair of dice. Out of 3 rolls, the player with the highest combined total would be declared the winner and receive the winnings. This particular game involved 3 players, with the ones with the 2 highest totals splitting the winnings and only the player with the lowest combined total losing everything. This was to prevent fights at the tavern. The idea being, with 2 winners and only 1 loser, the one doing the losing wouldn't want to fight both winners at once. When one of the players got up to leave the table, freeing up a spot to play, Riker, carrying his now half-empty mug of ale, walked over and took a seat. "I'd like to play," he said with a wide grin. The 2 other men sitting at the table looked at each other and nodded. "It's fine with us if you want to lose your money, boy," the first man said. He was a large muscular man, clearly a soldier in the Bay Aerith Empire's army. His hair was short on top and trimmed even shorter with a razor on the sides. This type of haircut was common for soldiers because it prevented hair from getting in the way during combat, and fit inside their helmets easily. His total appearance was an intimidating one, standing roughly 6'5" of solid muscle and boasting a sturdy-looking jawline. If there were ever a stereotype of someone who spent more of his time at a gym than in a library, this man was clearly a perfect fit. The other man was slender in frame, about 5'6" tall, with black hair and silver eyes. Upon a first glance, it might be overlooked, but upon further inspection, this man was clearly a half-elf. Both men wore military uniforms. Elves were uncommon in the Bay Aerith Empire, but not uncommon enough to draw excessive attention. Roughly 20% of the Bay Aerith Empire population comprised of elves. A long-lived species proficient in magic, humans born from an elf and a human often didn't possess the long ears that trademarked pure-blooded elves. Instead, their ears were still pointed but much shorter. Their overall slender builds and beautiful appearance made them distinguishable from average humans. However, their lifespans were only a bit longer than the average human. The game started, but then ended, almost as quickly, with Riker losing on the first round. He was understandably disappointed. As he stood up from his seat to leave, the large man, who he was just gambling with, snatched Riker's mug out of his hand. "Kids shouldn't drink, you know? But don't worry, I'll help you with that," the man said as he guzzled down the mug. Riker, having just finished a stressful day, gambling the last few coppers he had to his name away, and finally having his mug of ale that was meant to be his dinner, stolen from him, snapped. He turned and punched the large man square in the face. Unfortunately, his punch lacked the power to do any real damage, and only served to anger the man. Hey, you think you can punch me in the face when I'm doing you a favor? I'll teach you," the man said as he stood up to throw a punch of his own. Strangely, Riker thought the punch was slow. In fact, the whole tavern seemed to slow down to a crawl. Riker, in a state of shock, glanced around the room to see the rest of the patrons staring at him in slow motion. Every person but him seemed to be almost frozen in time. He turned his head back to the man to see his fist had almost reached his face. He leaned backwards a little to move his head out of the way, and suddenly time resumed its normal flow. The large man's second swing came in quick succession, but in that moment, time slowed down again for Riker. Although he didn't understand what was happening, he wasn't going to let this opportunity slip him by. He could see the incoming blows arc and sidestepped closer, reaching into the man's pocket and grabbing 4 copper coins. He figured this would serve as payment for stealing his mug from only a moment ago. Before time had a chance to resume its flow again, Riker used his shoulder to shove the large man in an attempt to create some distance for his escape. As time resumed, the man not only was shoved away but was sent hurtling into the wall. What was that?" the half-elf man said. Despite his shock, he readied himself, picking up the chair from underneath him as he stood and flung it at Riker. Once again, the flow of time slowed. Figuring this was enough, Riker turned to run out the door. After dodging the chair flung at him, time sped back up, the chair having missed its intended target and struck another patron. Titania's tavern was always a powder keg, so, naturally, the chair sailing across the room and shattering on the face of an unsuspecting man across the room was all it took to start a wild brawl. Soon mugs, chairs, tables, and all sorts of things were flying across the tavern. Riker used this opportunity to make his escape, moving as fast as he could to avoid being chased. He knew that if he was caught, it would likely mean his death. After all, starting a bar fight with Royal Imperial soldiers was a serious crime. After running down several back streets, Riker was sure no one had followed him. It's too bad I won't be able to visit Titania's for a while after this, he thought to himself. But at least he was alive. Ho ho ho. That was great. A loud voice shouted, "You really got the better of those two." This voice had the impressive volume and majesty of a lion's roar. Riker turned around in a panic but didn't see anyone. Hey, I'm over here." Riker turned back a second time to see a large imposing man towering in front of him. The man was a giant, easily 7 feet tall with short blonde hair, piercing blue eyes, and more muscles than the previous man who had stolen Riker's mug of ale. He wore a military uniform, this one with some kind of decorative, shiny metal on the man's collar. Riker looked up, with panic on his face. For a common peasant like him, attacking a member of the Royal Army meant he would be killed without so much as a trial. However, before he could say anything, "Ho ho ho. I like you, kid. You have some potential." Without any time to react, Riker saw what looked like a bolt of lightning flying straight at him. It was the man's fist making contact with his face. Riker then was knocked out from the blow, falling to the ground like a puppet that had just had its strings cut. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and please comment. You don't want to miss the next chapter.